The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holler.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm excited tonight, folks. We're trying something different. Our guest tonight is live from Lincoln Park in Chicago, and we're doing it over his cell phone. We tried to get the video going, but it's not going to be happening for tonight, folks.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoy his photo and my photo as well. Tonight's guest has written a book called Ghosts of Lincoln. Tonight we're going to be looking at all the stories about Lincoln haunting the White House, like Lincoln predicting his own death, attending seances, Lincoln's famous Who's Dead in the White House dream, and that Lincoln, are you ready for this, attended at least one seance in the White House itself. Now, sightings of Lincoln's ghost, as well as the ghost of his assassin, have been reported for more than 150 years. Lincoln, it seems, sounds like he's right there right now. Lincoln, it seems, was visited by eerie premonitions, morbid dreams, and unusual events that seem too bizarre to be coincidence. Lincoln has become the source of dozens of myths and paranormal mysteries. Adam Selzer is the author of over a dozen books, including the acclaimed Smart Aleck's Guide to American History. He runs ghost tours in Chicago, where he's got one coming up in an hour, and that's why he's outside preparing for them for nearly a decade. And thank goodness the weather is nice in Chicago tonight. And with his trademarked smart Alec humor, he's applied himself to wading through mountains of death certificates, pouring through reels and reels of newspaper archives, and occasionally he even has been known to stick his head right into crumbling old tombs. He lives in Chicago. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going, folks. Kick back. We're going to have a live show tonight, and when I say live, anything can happen, because our guest tonight is live from Lincoln Park on his cell phone in Chicago. How you doing, Adam? Thanks for joining us tonight.
Pretty well. How are you doing, Brett?
Good, thank you. And to everybody that's celebrating, or I shouldn't say celebrating, but I hope your fast is easy. Today is Yom Kippur, of course,
Right.
folks. And for all those that do, I hope your fast is easy. Adam, what led you to the White House, into the deep bowels of the White House, in search of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, anytime I start researching Lincoln, no matter what project it is, whether it's like the Smart Aleck's Guide to American History or just getting ready to make an argument over the Confederate flag or something, it's a real rabbit hole falling down Lincoln stuff. If you follow the footnotes in any given Lincoln book, find out just how weird some of the sources are, how bad some of the sources on famous stories about him are. It's really, it really can hook you. You find yourself just wading through piles and piles of stuff. It's almost like a treasure hunt. And I've been working in the ghost tour business and doing ghost lore books for quite a long time. Mixing the two of them together seemed like a natural fit.
Okay, Adam, let's start off. Let's dive in right away. Can you tell the folks about Who's Dead in the White House, the dream that Lincoln had?
Yeah, it's a famous story that started going around in the late 19th century, that shortly before his death, Lincoln was talking with his family and was talking about, do you believe in dreams? But I don't know if I believe that dreams tell the future, but I had one that's been troubling me for quite some time. I dreamed that I woke up and there was a funeral going on. So I walked into the East Room and they said, "Who is dead in the White House?" And someone told me it is the president. He was killed by an assassin.
Wow. That's pretty creepy. Now, how did he react to it? Like, who did he tell this story to that we have a record of it?
There's a couple of different, there's a few different versions of the story going around. Usually he's either telling one of his bodyguards. One of his bodyguards is actually the major source of the story, or telling his wife. And in one case, he actually sort of laughs and says, "Well, obviously it wasn't me. It was some other fellow who'd been assassinated, some other president." So maybe he was actually having a vision of James Garfield's death or something.
Or maybe even JFK's. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
Now, what's interesting, you mentioned his security guard. Now, his security guard, was that the guy that was supposed to be watching Lincoln the night he was assassinated?
Oh, no, he was off in Virginia that night. He was off taking care of business out there.
Because I don't know if
Lincoln was not one to take his security particularly seriously.
No kidding. Do you know the story about a security guard slipping off for a drink while he was...
I've heard a few of them. I haven't looked into it enough to make sure it's not apocryphal.
Yeah, apparently that's a true story. So anyways, Lincoln's security Secret Service agent, if you will, before there was Secret Service agents, slipped down the stairs out of the theater he was in, and right next door there was a watering hole where he indulged himself. Meanwhile, his president he's supposed to be watching was being assassinated. Is there any stories around the Lincoln Theater that he attended?
The Ford Theater?
The Ford Theater, excuse me.
Ford's Theater. Yeah, there have been stories about Ford's Theater almost since day one, really. There's one story that I remember reading when I was a kid, and I looked into it, saying that that when Lincoln's funeral and also when Kennedy's funeral passed by Ford's Theater, a piece of the exterior fell off. And I couldn't really verify that story. I don't think the funeral train actually went past Ford's Theater, in fact. But there's been a lot of different stories, and one of them that I really wished I could have researched in more depth is there was a story in the late 60s, early 70s. One day there was a performance about Martin Luther King going on stage at Ford's Theater shortly after they reopened as a theater, which is it was like 100 years before they used it as a theater again. But there was a play about Martin Luther King going on, and all of a sudden there was this big boom. A microphone apparently fell down from the booth where Lincoln had been sitting, landed on the stage, then rolled out the back door, following the exact path that John Wilkes Booth would have done, jumping out of the box and then running across the stage and out the back door. And what I would have liked to research this more. Apparently, according to the stories that were in the papers in the 70s, everybody who was there knew about this. Everybody saw it. The person who was on stage at the time playing Martin Luther King Jr. was actually Billy D. Williams. And I really did try to interview Billy D. Williams about this, but through his representatives, he declined. If I wanted to be really dramatic, I could say Mr. Williams was so terrified that to this day he refuses to discuss the night.
That's funny. I wasn't aware of that story. Adam, when did all these stories about Lincoln's ghost start popping up? Was it shortly after his death? I think of John
For the most part, it was quite a long time after his death. There are a few stories, like the ghost of his funeral train, that got some very early stories on. But as for Lincoln haunting the White House himself and things like that, there's just a couple of stray stories that I could find from before about the 1910s or 1920s. By the 1920s, it was very common knowledge that Lincoln's ghost was haunting the White House, or at least among White House staff. But before that, you don't really find a whole lot about it. And one could say that the supply of people who knew Lincoln and could tell stories about Lincoln alive was starting to dry up. So ghost stories started circulating.
Yeah, I was going to draw an analogy. There's no ghost stories about John F. Kennedy that I know of.
I can't think of any either, actually.
And I think it's because it's too soon, quote unquote. It's kind of like 9/11.
Right.
I don't think we'll be hearing ghost stories about apparitions and things like that at ground zero. Maybe for another 50, 70 years, if ever.
Right. Yeah, it's a thing I have on my tours. I generally have a too soon rule on my tours. There are one or two exceptions that I make occasionally, but in general, if something just, people get mad about it, like, why are all these ghosts from the 1890s? Don't you have any from last year? Like, well, I heard of stuff from last year, but I'm not going to tell you about it. That would be really crass.
Yeah, exactly. Can you tell us a little bit about your tour? If people want to come down to Chicago, where
Well,
would we?
I do a number of different tours. Actually, next month I'm going to be doing a tour through the Atlas Obscura company called Grave Robbing 101. And it's we're going to go around the old city cemetery. I'll show you, it's a park now, but I'll show you relics of the cemetery. There's still one tomb that's standing. And also I'll be telling you a lot of stories about grave robbing that went on there. They had a real problem with grave robbing in the 1850s, 1860s there. And not only that, but it'll also be teaching you the tricks of the trade, little rhymes to help you to remember whether or not to drink things you find in the coffin, everything you need to know to launch your career as a 19th century resurrection man. But my main tours, I do a lot of ghost tours for a company called Chicago Hauntings. For them, I run about 200 ghost tours a year. And we either walk around Lincoln Park, or I get you in a bus and take people around murder sites, disaster sites, body dumps, abandoned cemeteries, all sorts of places that are supposed to be haunted.
Is there any ghost stories in Chicago about Al Capone?
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre site has long been said as a haunted place, but Capone was down in Florida for that whole thing. There are a couple of stories about him in places where he's known to have been, like the Lexington Hotel, where his vault was, that Geraldo had so much trouble with. There was some talk about that being haunted, but really I think it was just the kind of thing some people would say. Capone wasn't really in Chicago for all that long. He came to power here in mid-1920s, early 30s. He went to prison, and for most of the time in between that, he was either in prison in Philadelphia or hanging out as an estate in Miami.
Interesting stuff indeed, without question. Adam Selzer is our guest tonight, folks. www.nightfrightshow.com. There you will find a link to his book. His book is called Ghosts of Lincoln, and it is apropos for tonight as we slowly slip into fall, and the nights are getting longer and the days are getting shorter, and thank goodness the weather's good tonight, because Adam is live right now from Lincoln Park. Apropos, don't you think, folks?
Yep.
In Chicago. Can you describe
right next to Lincoln? Where I am right now? Right now, I'm actually right in front of the Lincoln statue. There's a very large statue, one of the better-looking Lincoln statues, really. He's standing up, holding onto his jacket like he's about to say something important.
What area of Chicago is Lincoln Park in?
North side.
The north side. Oh, okay. The famous north side, as they say. Okay.
We only have three sides. The east side is a lake.
Yeah, and I swam in it, actually. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I was there in the summer. It's just terrific. And I put on 30 pounds by going to the Cheesecake Factory. Thank you very much.
That's one meal at the Cheesecake Factory.
No kidding. What's this story I hear that Lincoln once wrote on, of all things, a flying piano? Is there any validity to that?
Oh, the amount of time I spent trying to back up that story. There is, in fact, in Team of Rivals, the book about Lincoln that won every award there is, and formed the basis for the Lincoln movie, really. There's a story that one day his wife Mary went out to a seance, and Lincoln decided on a whim, well, I'll go with you. And they went out to this medium's house. And the medium's real trick is that she would play the piano and get spirits to lift the piano up and down. And according to the story, Lincoln and a couple other people hopped on top of the piano just to show that they couldn't hold it down. Had a good little ride on it. And I spent more time than I should probably admit tracing that story back to its sources, tracing every different version of the story that was ever published in the early newspapers. I just like the idea of, so many stories about Lincoln, so many of the first-hand accounts show him as really miserable and upset in the White House. He had a rough time in the White House. In addition to a civil war going on, he lost a child while he was in the White House.
That's right.
I like the idea that he had some fun, too.
Can you tell us a little bit about the tragedy that surrounded Lincoln?
There was a lot of stuff that went around Lincoln. Well, he had 4 children. Only one of them actually survived to adulthood. 2 of them he buried himself. One died after a few years after he did. He was kind of prone to fits of melancholy himself. It's hard to diagnose somebody from this far into the future, but it's entirely likely that he suffered from some form of depression. His wife did as well, in fact.
Wasn't his wife very much into seances and very much into the paranormal and spirituality?
Yes, his wife definitely. We can debate a little bit the extent to which it was really the case that she was really into this stuff, but it does seem to be that she was very, very into seances. There's a number of diary excerpts where senators will say, "Oh, great, I ran into Mary Lincoln again." She had to stand there and smile and nod while she got into all this seance stuff.
Wow. Can you give us any examples of some of the stuff that she may have come across during her life in the White House?
During her life in the White House, what we know of mainly is she came across a lot of frauds. Um,
Okay, people looking out to try and make a buck off of her mourning, I guess.
yeah, after their son Willie died, she went into a really, really deep depression. Abraham did as well.
Hmm.
But after that, she also got very, very into seances, trying to contact him. There's one of them from a New Year's Day of 1863. Senator Orville Browning wrote in his diary that he ran into Mrs. Lincoln, and she told him all about what she had heard of the seance yesterday. She had messages from Willie. She had advice from dead senators about how to conduct the war and how we were going to need a whole new cabinet now.
You still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, Adam. Sorry, I heard you drop out, and I just wasn't sure.
So
Go ahead,
me,
please.
me taking a breath. I was
No
just
worries.
taking a breath. Yeah, there were a number of things like that. And also, General Sickles wrote later on, he almost felt embarrassed having to do this for her. But, if Mrs. Lincoln asked you to come to a seance, you would go to the seance with her.
Yes. Can you tell us about Abraham Lincoln's journey into a seance?
There's been a lot of different stories about him going to seances over the years, and whether it was actually true or not has kind of been split along party lines. Spiritualists tend to insist that, oh yes, he went to seances all the time. He took a lot of stock in what was going on in the seances, or even if he wasn't a big believer, he at least tried it out and he was very respectful of it all the time. Other people who knew Lincoln said there's no way in the world he would have gone to a seance. He was the most practical man in the world. Usually you can divide it up by the people who didn't believe in seances didn't think Lincoln went, and the people who did believe in them did think that Lincoln went. I was able to find, though, there was one independent confirmation that General Sickles, who had been at Gettysburg and knew the Lincolns pretty well, years later, he was written up. There was a book called Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist, written by a medium named Nellie Colburn Maynard. And Mrs. Maynard didn't really talk too much about the piano floating incident herself, but she talked a lot about going to the White House and basically took all the credit for talking Lincoln into the Emancipation Proclamation. And her story, that we know that she was a real person, and we know that she was introduced to Lincoln. There's a letter of introduction on file in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress, but the dates in her stories don't really line up. It's not really considered reliable accounting, and also it's another case of she was a spiritualist, so she thinks Lincoln was a spiritualist. But one of the witnesses that she named in that book was General Daniel Sickles, and this was one of I tried to look up responses from all of her different sources. The hardest one to find was General Sickles, but I did find in reading all of the reviews of that book that when it first came out, something came up in one of the spiritualist newspapers that has recently been archived online. Somebody mentioned General Sickles' angry response to it. They were really angry because apparently Sickles had said something about Lincoln joking at a seance. They thought, how in the world could that man have been steering our country through the Civil War and making jokes in the White House? Which really, we know Lincoln did that all the time. He loved a good dirty joke, Lincoln did, and a practical joke as well. But so I had to find this out. It was he mentioned in the spiritualist newspaper mentioned that it was General Sickles' response in something called Miner's Journal. And I finally found a library that had the Miner's Journal on microfilm. It was like the Schuylkill Valley Historical Society or something. I had to pay through the nose to get this article, but they dug through their microfilms and found this response General Sickles had written to Nettie Colburn Maynard's book. And he went into a long story about going to a seance, and he said, yes, there was one. I went to several seances at the White House. I don't remember exactly who the mediums were, but I'm sure Mrs. Colburn was probably one of them. But one of them, Abraham himself actually did show up for. And he seemed to think the thing was jolly good entertainment. But then Mary started telling him, there is a medium in this town who can actually make pianos float. Which, you can imagine me jumping for joy when I saw that, having spent hours and hours trying to trace these floating piano stories. But Lincoln's response to that was he said, well, watch this. I can do that too. So he walked over to the piano, sat down on the bench, and started banging at the keys while bouncing the whole thing up and down on his knees. And then he turned around, and then he turned and said, you see, Mother, I can make pianos float too.
What a great story. Adam Selzer is our guest tonight, folks. You'll find this story and more in his new book called Ghosts of Lincoln. Easy way to get it, as always, www.nightfrightshow.com. And we're also going to put a link up there so you can sign up for Adam's ghost tours in Chicago, and he is indeed live tonight from Lincoln Park. How great is that? All the way from Chicago, and Chicago's a great city, folks. I've been there, and just amazing history. It's an amazing place to be. People are terrific, and you got to check out the Cheesecake Factory, and you'll end up looking like me. So there we go. Continuing right along, did Lincoln ever see any ghosts himself while he was in the White House?
Not that I know of, no.
And his wife, was she?
Not that I could not.
Nothing, eh?
No, she certainly went to an awful lot of seances. I don't know how much she actually saw personally.
Okay, let's talk about other presidents then. People that have perhaps seen Lincoln's ghost. I know there's a famous story about George Bush, and now I'm not sure if Lincoln's ghost was involved with that, but apparently George Bush, when he was in the White House, had seen some weird going-ons.
There was some. I know that Barbara Bush in her book said that she mentioned that she and George never actually saw Lincoln's ghost themselves. You know, it's a big story in the White House, the ghost of Lincoln. They never saw it. They wish they would have. Ronald Reagan never saw it either, but his daughter did. His daughter and her husband actually reported seeing Lincoln's ghost quite a bit. And apparently Lincoln's dog would start barking at nothing, and Ronald would at least joke that it was well, if you see, if that's Mr. Lincoln, tell him to get over here. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask him.
Ronald Reagan had a great sense of humor. Yeah. Now, his wife also was into spiritualism.
I believe she was, yeah. I think a lot of people who find themselves in the White House start looking for answers in strange places, or just looking for new advice that they wouldn't get someplace else.
Is there a story that you found that I think it was Amy Carter saw the ghost? I think it was Tad Lincoln. Was it Tad that had passed away?
She said that she was keenly aware of the fact that Tad died in her bed. I don't know how much of it was paranormal, and just kind of she knew that he had died in the bed, and it kind of was Willie Lincoln died in the bed. Tad died several years later, but she was certainly spooked by that. She was never able to get a good night's sleep in that bed. A lot of people weren't.
Can you tell us the story about Winston Churchill?
I love the story about Winston Churchill. I dearly hope that it's true. It's one of those ones I couldn't get a good source on it, but it's been going around since the 70s. Churchill visited the White House for a few weeks during World War II. And according to legend, we do know that he didn't want to stay in Lincoln's room. Something about the bed. He tried practically every room before he found one that works, until he found one that was just right. But the story goes that one day Churchill came out of the bath and was standing there dripping wet and naked when he saw the ghost of Abraham Lincoln standing there looking out the window. And the ghost looked over at him, and Churchill said, "Mr. President, you seem to have me at a disadvantage." Whereupon Lincoln smiled and disappeared. And I dearly want the story to be true. The thing that makes it, well, besides not being able to find a good source on it, the thing is that I don't think Churchill would have seen being naked as a disadvantage. The guy who was the butler at the White House wrote a book about his experiences there. Talked about Churchill for a couple of pages. Main thing he remembered is the staff never quite got used to the fact that Churchill spent half his time naked. They would go to bring him brandy or cigars, and he would just be strutting around nude.
That sounds like Churchill. He's a crusty old codger.
Yeah, Churchill and Lyndon Johnson, too. They both seemed to like being naked around the White House and didn't care who saw.
Well, there's a famous story about Lyndon Johnson that you may be aware of as well. Lyndon Johnson used to sit on the throne, as they say, and while he was defecating, he would be telling his aides and dictating things to his aides, forcing them to be just on the outskirts of an open door. So, a bit of a strange codger, too. Very, very strange.
Yeah.
Did you come up against any surprises when you were doing your research? Was there something that stuck out more than something else?
Well, I'll tell you what did stick out is how many things like that General Sickles story and a lot of firsthand accounts in these old newspaper articles that have never really been written about before, that have never been in any other Lincoln book. I really thought that Lincoln, there's so many thousands of books about Lincoln, I really thought we'd covered everything by now. I thought that at best I would just be trying to put my own spin on things and try to do a little bit of sorting fact and fiction, but I imagine most of that work had already been done before. And really I found that even in the people who had tried to sort fact and fiction from these Lincoln predictions of his own death dreams, I found that there was a lot of stuff out there that they didn't appear to be aware of, a lot of sources that kind of slipped through the cracks over the years. And that just amazed me how much stuff is still out there.
Now you're doing your ghost tour from Lincoln Park, right near a statue of Lincoln himself. Has there
Yeah.
ever been any visitations or anybody ever seeing Lincoln himself in that area?
In the park, I'm not sure about. We know Lincoln actually was in the park. He had shortly after his election, he had a meeting in a house just up on the north end of the park. So he at least would have passed through here and probably took a look down at the. Well, probably walked up to the cupola because when you're in a house with a cupola, you go up to the cupola. And he probably looked down. At the time, this whole park was a cemetery. So he probably would have looked down and tried to, wondered if there would be any fresh graves from the upcoming conflict showing up down there.
Mm.
As far as his ghost, the main one I hear about his ghost in Chicago is this is one of the places where people talk about the ghost of the funeral train.
Can you tell us that one?
Now that one's been going around. I think really the early ghost story about Lincoln that I found was from 1872, and that was a time when the brakeman who worked the railroads in Albany, New York, gave an interview to the local newspaper and said that every year on the anniversary of Lincoln's funeral train rolling through, they would see the ghost of the train. It was a very elaborate story that they told. They said that first they would know it was coming because all of the clocks would stop.
Ooh.
Then they would start to hear the thing coming closer, and then they would start to hear music as the train approached. And when the train got close enough that they could see it, there would be a band of skeletons playing funeral dirges. And from there, frankly, the story gets a little more over the top. They talked about seeing the ghost of every single Union soldier who had perished in battle carrying his coffin on that train. And we're talking like hundreds of thousands of people here. This would have been a massive, massive train. But something I found that this was 1872, that's way earlier than most other Lincoln stories are. And I found that there's a lot of different stories about this funeral train showing up. After Lincoln was assassinated, they kind of took his body on tour. Everybody in all the major cities had a chance to pay their last respects, and it kind of brought legends with it whenever it came in its wake. The story goes that when it pulled into Chicago, the waters of Lake Michigan were instantly stilled, and the brown thrush, didn't sing for an entire year. No brown thrush was heard singing for an entire year after Lincoln's death. My favorite little variation, there's little variations on the ghost of the funeral train story all over the place. The one in Chicago is possibly my favorite one. They say here that not only can you see the ghost of the train pulling up to Michigan Avenue and what is now Roosevelt, you can actually see Lincoln himself dancing around the coffin with the flesh dropping off of his face.
Oh my goodness.
Which is what wonderful image, even though it doesn't really hold up to research very well. He was re-embalmed so many times, the flesh should not be dropping off of his face.
I'm telling you, folks, Chicago's where it all takes place. You got to get there.
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment in Chicago.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Adam Selzer is our guest tonight. We're talking about his new book, Ghosts of Lincoln, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot. And a big hearty shout out to Kelly Logue, who puts it all together for us. He maintains our website, and without him, this show just couldn't exist because it's only a one-person show. That's me, folks. And Kelly volunteers for me. He's a terrific guy, and I appreciate it very much. Okay, let's go back into it. Some more about Lincoln and the lore. There was a lot of turmoil going on during his presidency, obviously the Civil War, things of that nature. And then he has two sons die back to back. Was there, I don't know, did people see him as sort of a doom and gloom president? Perhaps like a Linus? Is it Linus? With the little, cloud over his head?
or Eeyore, perhaps.
Eeyore. Yeah.
Some people did. There was, he certainly has a reputation sometimes as being a very doom and gloom president, but he was also a funny guy. He loved a good dirty joke. Was perfectly willing to pepper humor into all of his speeches.
Did you see the movie Lincoln, by the way?
I did, yeah.
And based on your studies and character analysis and things of that nature, how close do you think Daniel Day-Lewis came to capturing?
I think that's as close as we're ever going to get to seeing what it was like to see Lincoln up and walking around. I think he did an excellent job.
That's pretty good criticism by yourself, and certainly. Doing research for a book like this, as you said before, there's been tons and tons of books, and you want to make yours original. How did you approach making your book stand out from all the others about Lincoln's ghosts and all the ghosts of the White House?
What I wanted to do is I wanted to trace all of the stuff back to the earliest source that I could. There's a lot of stuff going around about White House ghost stories and Washington ghost stories and things like that, but really you find that a lot of them haven't really got a source from before the 1970s. A lot of stuff, well, there was a big newspaper like the Pull-Out magazine that came with newspapers. There was a big article about ghosts in the White House in one of those in about the 1950s. And that was really the major source for an awful lot of stuff. A lot of it's, nobody ever actually cites that magazine, but there have been very, very few original research books done that cover this sort of topic. So what I wanted to do is nowadays it's gotten a lot easier. In the last 10 years, more and more newspapers have been digitized so that they're actually searchable. What would have before taken a lot of time just traveling around to places that had all of the right microfilms. Now it's gotten an awful lot easier to just look things up. More and more stuff I can just do on the internet. I still had to travel some. I still had to spend a lot of time wading through microfilm. But more and more of this information is out there online now.
So that's much easier for researchers in general.
Yeah.
No question. Were you able ever to get to the White House?
No, I've actually never been to the White House.
Just curious.
I've only been to D.C. Passing through on a Greyhound bus one time.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
It kind of took me by surprise. I was just passing through. I didn't really know what the route we were taking was, and suddenly my friend and I realized, man, this is a massive cemetery that we're in. And then suddenly we saw the Washington Monument. It's like, wow, we're in D.C.
We're in D.C. Yeah, right there. Was there any stories that you could ascertain from the Obama administration? What's going on right now?
As far as ghosts that they're seeing now, not yet. No.
Nothing, eh?
It hasn't really been asked about. It's almost considered, I think, impolite to ask a president about ghost lore while he's a sitting president. Just imagine what Fox News would do if he said he saw Lincoln's ghost. Just imagine. And I really hope they don't ask him about it, just so we're spared all of that noise.
I was thinking of the two girls actually, because I'm trying to build an arc back to that Amy sighting, and if they experienced anything.
Yeah, there were stories about Truman's daughters would. Truman planned at one point to play a joke on his daughter, having one of the White House staffers dress up as Lincoln to scare her.
Jeez.
And
Halloween must be a nightmare at the White House. Wonder if they give out candy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I imagine, eventually everybody in the White House writes a book. I wonder if maybe somewhere down the road, Sash and Malia will write a book of their own and talk about stories that they whispered to each other about Lincoln's ghost or things that the staff told them.
When you were doing your research about Lincoln, were there historical facts, not in the paranormal realm, that you were unaware of, and you kind of came out admiring him even a little bit more?
More and more, yeah. I had studied him and written about him quite a few times, but it's really so many things. The more you research the guy, the more interesting he gets. Just the sheer fact that this guy came out of nowhere. The fact that this guy even got nominated for president in the first place is almost unbelievable. I mean, this guy, 20 years ago, he had been a junior house nobody party hack for 2 years, and that was about it as far as national politics, other than being like a state senator. There had been a couple of presidents by then who had not been born aristocrats and raised to this sort of life, but by the time they became presidents, they were governors and military heroes. Lincoln was just a popular speaker whose speeches hadn't been good enough to win his party the control of the state Senate 2 years earlier in 1858 when he debated with Douglas all across the state. Now, he was a famous speaker, he was a famous guy, but really an odd choice for them to actually nominate for president. Very, almost supernatural, really.
Do you think
the man just came out of nowhere?
Do you think the United States would have survived without Lincoln at the helm?
I'm not really sure. Well, we always find our way through somehow or another. But just to be able to get us through the Civil War and also end slavery at the end of the Civil War was a major chess game. He endlessly frustrated a lot of people who wanted him to take further action than he was doing. But if he had done that, it might have set the whole thing back in the long run. He played the long game. And yeah, it's hard to imagine anybody else really getting us through that the way that he did.
Yeah, he was pretty amazing president. One of my favorites without question. Him and
Yeah.
JFK are right up there. Let's go back to a little bit of the paranormal aspects. Now, we know he lost two sons. Now, I had heard, and I don't know if this is true, you can verify this for me, that he had actually dug up his son a couple of times.
Well, dug up is kind of a strong word, but there were stories. His son Willie, after he died, was placed in the vault, the family vault of a friend of his in Washington D.C. And apparently he did have him disinterred a couple of times just to look on his face again. That's a story that's gone around quite a bit. I couldn't find a really good source on it, but I found, pretty good.
Okay.
And it's also entirely possible at the time. I'm not sure what kind of casket they had him in, but at the time, the 1850s, 1860s was the age of the Fisk metallic burial case, which had like a really ornate metal caskets that had a viewing window over the face.
That's right. Yeah, I remember. Well, I don't remember them, but I remember seeing them in all the old
Right.
vampire movies. They're Dracula.
Yeah, they still have a cult following today.
Is that right? Jeez.
Oh
No.
yeah, if I what well, there's actually they dug one up here in Lincoln Park just about 15 years ago, and I'll mention that sometimes on the tour. You can always tell if there's a mortician on the tours. You mention a Fisk metallic burial case, and they go, yes.
Collector's item.
Oh yeah, big collector's item.
So, when you do that resurrection tour, there you go, folks. Now you're talking virtually.
I'm looking at a tomb right now that might just have one inside of it, actually, in fact.
Is the park you're in right now, Lincoln Park, is it still a graveyard, or have all
in that there are still bodies here, yeah. Yeah, exactly how many got it was the city cemetery for about 20 or 30 years up through the end of the Civil War. And while they were in the process of moving everything, the Great Chicago Fire wrecked everything. It wrecked all the records, wrecked a lot of the monuments, and really a lot of times there just wasn't good paperwork on where everybody was to begin with. So really every time they dig, they find stuff here. There is one tomb still standing, the tomb of the Couch family, which I'm looking at right now. That, as of 100 years ago, the grandson of the guy it was built for said that there were 8 people in there, but nobody's entirely sure anymore. But yeah, there's definitely an awful lot of bodies still buried under here.
What's the vibe like?
It's just a park, really. Now, in the middle of the night when we're walking through the park, it can get a little bit spooky. But in general, it's a happy place. People walk by the tomb every day and don't even realize what it is. I mean, it looks like a tomb. It doesn't look like anything else. It seems so out of place now that people see it and think it must be like a power station or something.
Interesting. I think every city has a park like that was probably either the first or second graveyard. I hail from a city.
All the time.
Yeah, I hail from a city called Montreal, and right downtown, where a lot of people don't realize this, where the Sun Life building is, folks, Dominion Square used to be, that was Montreal's second graveyard. And what they do, it's very common, and even here in Kingston, Ontario, there's a place called Skeleton Park. That's its nickname. Guess why? What they do is they just remove the tombstones, because once you get past the great-grandchildren, even the grandchildren of the people that have passed away, they stop visiting the graveyard, and the graveyard usually becomes overrun, and they need the land, so they just move the tombstones, leave the bodies at rest, and move on. And that sounds much the case as what's happened there in Lincoln Park. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, they at least made an effort to move the bodies here. Sometimes they don't do that.
Yeah, every now and then, we get a story in Montreal, at least once a year, where people will be sitting in the park having their lunch. And because of the ground shifting in the water, et cetera, and, like Chicago, we get a ton of snow and frost and everything. Bones tend to make their way up to the surface.
Yep.
So they get found. They get found, without question.
For the most part, the people buried here, it would just be like dust and skeletal fragments. You'd practically have to be an archaeologist even to know what you're looking for at this point. But every now and then they'll find a complete coffin.
Is that right? Wow, That's incredible. Speaking of coffins, what type of coffin any idea what type of coffin Lincoln was buried in?
Lincoln was in a lead-lined coffin. For a while he was put inside of a white marble sarcophagus. He's had several coffins at this point, actually.
Interesting.
Because at various times they moved the body several times. After they first put it in the tomb, they moved the casket 16 or 17 times, and a couple of times the coffin had decayed, so they had to put him in a new one. There's a lead casing on the inside that's been the same the entire time. But he's been in several others since then. There's kind of a scandal. They had one new one built for him, but but it was a couple of feet too short, so they just buried it on the cemetery ground someplace. The next time, about a couple of decades later, when they were moving again, when they were digging again to move, and they came across that coffin, like, hold everything, we found a coffin. And of course, it just turned out to be the old spare one.
The old spare one. Man,
Yep.
what a story. What a story. Where are his remains now? Forgive my ignorance.
Right now, they're in Springfield, Illinois, under about 10 feet of cement in his tomb.
Okay.
They eventually, they moved it several times, and eventually, it was kind of a trend in the 1890s that guys were getting buried under massive piles of cement and railroad ties, possibly because there was this merchant in New York named A.T. Stewart, whose body was snatched and held for ransom, which they also tried to do with Lincoln at one point. Some guys really did try to steal his body and got the coffin halfway out the sarcophagus before they were stopped. But finally in 1901, Robert got the idea that, okay, I've had enough of this stuff. Why don't we just, we're going to move him someplace permanent and not do this anymore. So they took out the coffin one last time to put him under 10 feet of cement. But when they did, they decided, you know, there's all these conspiracy theories saying that he's not really in there. We'd better open up the coffin and make sure. So in 1901, they actually did open his coffin and found that he was actually still in pretty good shape.
Oh, jeez. You do have a great sense of humor, Adam.
Yeah, actually, he was, well, for a guy, it was still recognizably Abraham Lincoln, I mean.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Except that his skin was at different times when they opened it, it was a dark copper color, so he would have looked exactly like he does on a penny.
That's very good. That's really good. After he passed away, did Mary Lincoln, his wife, did she have any visitations by him? Is there any reported visitations?
She said that she did a couple of times. She went to seances all the time and said that she was talking to him.
Any validation in those? Could you find
hard to say, really. You know, I would say most likely no, or more likely it was out of her own imagination or just something that a phony medium was tricking her into thinking. But at the same time, who knows?
Who knows? Who knows? Have there been other presidents in the White House that have been seen, presidents that have passed away? Or is Lincoln probably the main focus of everybody?
Lincoln is sort of the main focus of them, yeah. Occasionally you've also heard, there were also stories about, I think, Dolly Madison or James Madison haunting the place. There was a couple of sources I found about Willie Lincoln was seen during, I think it was the Grant administration, though I'm not entirely sure. It was another one I found a lot of books that mentioned it from the 1970s, but I couldn't find an original source on it.
Just speculation, but if Lincoln's ghost is hanging out at the White House, any idea why he would want to go back to the White House? That would, to me, would be a source of tragedy for him, a source of disdain, especially.
Yeah, I would figure he'd find someplace more pleasant to hang out.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Or yeah.
Go ahead.
Often we expect ghosts to haunt the places where they actually died, not where they hung out while they were alive. And in that case, it would be the house across the street from Ford's Theater. His deathbed is actually in the museum right in front of me over here at the Chicago History Museum.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. Is there any rumors or any stories from either his deathbed or the house across the street where he passed away?
There were occasional stories about the house across the street. People would talk about going upstairs and hearing the ghost upstairs, or the ghost of people who used to own the house would be talked about there as well. Nothing particularly concrete.
He died several hours after he was shot, 7 o'clock in the morning, if I'm not mistaken. And the bed, if I'm not mistaken, he was put on, the deathbed as you call it. He was he was a very tall guy, 6'4".
He was a tall guy, yeah.
They had to put him in kind of not perpendicular.
Yeah, diagonally, yeah.
Yeah. And I just think of the poor guy suffering all that time. And
I don't think he ever regained consciousness. The bullet, he probably never knew what hit him.
And that was it. That was
bullet went right into his brain. He probably fast enough that he didn't feel a thing. He just slipped right out of consciousness, and that was it.
Wow. So if you were to spend an evening at the White House, what room would you spend it in?
Oh, if they could get me into the Lincoln bedroom, I'm sure I'd love to be in the Lincoln bedroom.
Just to report on the vibe and everything else, yeah.
Right, and also the Crimson Room is one where they usually say that the seances were held. Exactly which room was the Crimson Room now we'd have to do some research on.
Yeah, that would be interesting to find out as well.
Yeah, and it's also a thing, Lincoln probably slept in every room in the place. Like when we talk about the Lincoln's bedroom, it wasn't really the room that he slept in. Exactly which one that is I think kind of lost to history. It was mostly the room that he did most of his work in.
The Lincoln Library, is there any stories that emanate from there?
I couldn't find any specific ones, but I'd be shocked if there wasn't. Really, we tend to think that Lincoln is haunting every place where he ever set foot, and several places where he didn't, in fact. One of the earliest sightings I could find of him was they said that Lincoln's ghosted. There was a little newspaper article saying he had been sighted in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, of all places.
Of all places. Do you think our psyche is because we can't let heroes go? We want to hang on.
I think that's certainly. I think that's a part of it. Yeah, I think that's a part of ghosts in general is just sort of how our brains react to death, and the fact that we can't really fathom death. We can't really fathom the fact that people are gone forever.
Are you a believer in afterlife?
Sometimes I am. Sometimes I'm not.
Are you a believer in the paranormal?
Again, sometimes I am. Sometimes I'm not. You know, there's 150 definitions of the word ghost in the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm sure I can find some of those to get behind.
Have you had any personal experiences?
I have, yeah. I run 200 ghost tours a night every now and then. We will see something that I can't explain.
Get out.
But that's kind of where it stops. When I can't explain it, that's just kind of where it stops. Is that I can't explain it. One good instance is, one guy I spend a lot of time talking about is H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy.
Oh, I don't know the
I've
story.
spent more time researching that guy than anybody. He's generally advertised as America's first serial killer, which isn't entirely accurate. He wasn't really even the first one in Chicago, but he had businesses and buildings all over the city, the most famous of which was down in Englewood, a place that came to be called the Murder Castle. It's a 3-story building that he had rigged up with all kinds of secret passages and trapdoors. And there's a lot of just urban legends that have grown up around it recently, but we don't really need them. It was spooky enough as it was. And up on the north side, he had businesses all over the city. He had a house up in the north suburbs, and halfway up to there was a building that he said was a glass bending factory. Now, exactly what he was doing there, nobody's entirely sure, but he certainly wasn't bending any glass. And there's kind of a short list of things that a known multi-murderer would have been doing with a 150-foot-long furnace. So really, I just started taking people to the place where that was. I found a couple of stray newspaper articles about it from the 1890s newspaper archives, triangulated where it was. It's just a little dead-end street and a vacant lot now, where it used to be. And I started taking people out there on ghost tours, really just because it happened to be pretty close to the route. And I figured the people are always asking me about H.H. Holmes stuff. The Murder Castle site itself is too far away to go to on most tours. But I started taking people out of this place just as a historical curiosity. So many weird things happened out there that I had to add it onto the ghost tour as well. Most notably, we had a couple of sightings of a woman in a black dress who would appear there and then just disappear.
Oh, that's creepy. So I want to plug your ghost tour right now. So tell us a little bit about what people could expect on the tour and what people have captured either on video or camera.
Every now and then we do get some weird pictures. Most of them I can explain. Some of them I really can't. We get off the bus 3 or 4 times on an average tour. If you go to ChicagoHauntings.com, that's the company I usually work for. Also, go to MysteriousChicago.com. That'll link you both to my blog, where I talk about all the research that we do on these things, and also to the Mysterious Chicago tours that I'm running for Atlas Obscura, like this Grave Robbing 101 next month. The first one of that is already sold out. I've got a new route for the darker side of the history of Taylor Street down on the near south side. All kinds of cool stuff.
Cool stuff. Is there any abandoned psych hospitals that you go by?
Not really go by. They've all generally been torn down by now until you get out into the suburbs. But, you really just don't hear about an abandoned mental hospital that isn't supposed to be haunted.
Yeah, precisely. There's one right here in Kingston that is supposed to be just inundated with orbs and ghosts and things of that nature. And just an amazing source for all kinds of ghost stories and things like that. Now, how do you ascertain when you're doing your research on what is going to make a good story and what is just going to be, like that? In other words, how do you filter out garbage and keep the good stuff?
Well, I like the backstories to check out. That's the thing that I like. There's a lot of red flags. If somebody says woman in white or hanged herself from the ceiling or Indian burial ground, those just kind of sound to me like somebody just made it up and just wanted to, or just is telling me what they think I want to hear. There's certain tropes that come up a lot in ghost stories, like people being hanged from the ceiling. I think that the vast majority of people who kill themselves in this country use a gun to do it in real life, but in ghost stories it's almost always hanging yourself from the ceiling. And it could, there's a couple of ways you can look at that. It could just be like a folklore motif, or possibly it just is more conducive to turning you into a ghost if you die while doing the funky Spider-Man.
That's funny. www.nightfrightshow, folks. Click on tonight's guest's book cover, which is called Ghosts of Lincoln. Sorry, let me get it right. Ghosts of Lincoln, that's right. And you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. It's a great time to do it. We're heading into fall. Adam Selzer's our guest tonight, and also the author of the book, and he's got all kinds of great stories. And he also runs some haunted tours out of Chicago. All that information will be on the website. As always, folks, links and stuff like that to his blogs. Adam, what's next for you, my friend?
What is next for me? I have a new book out next year. It's a novel called Just Kill Me through Simon & Schuster. It's about a ghost tour guide who finds out that her company is making places more haunted by killing people there.
Oh, jeez. What a great idea.
That's going to be a lot of it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of good history in it, a lot of really good dark humor, very dark humor.
Dark humor. Have you run into any stories about JFK in Chicago?
JFK in Chicago stories? There's a couple of like scandalous stories, stories more about his personal life than anything else, certainly more so than his afterlife. There is a story. He was supposed to come here in November of 1963, but they canceled it at the last minute because they would have been driving him through a warehouse district that they thought was too dangerous.
That's a true story, actually.
Yeah. People were already lining up for the rope lines.
Yeah, that's 2 weeks actually, folks, before Kennedy was killed, to the day. And do you know about Abraham Bolden?
Abraham Bolden, refresh my memory.
First African-American Secret Service agent.
Really?
By JFK, right in Chicago. And in 1962, and he was on his Secret Service detail, of course, was not on duty that day and was instrumental in getting President Kennedy to cancel in Chicago because they were terrified, because he was being hunted. He was,
yeah.
I'm a big Kennedy guy, and I've written a book on it, and I just wanted to let you know that.
Well, also the guy that Sam Giancana supposedly said was the trigger man was assassinated here in Chicago.
Oh, I don't
know. His name was Richard Kane. He was shot at Rosa's Sandwich Shop. Was a mob FBI double agent that supposedly Sam Giancana said was the actual trigger man in Dallas. Sam Giancana was like the head of the mob in the 70s before he was shot himself, which tends to be what happens to the head of the mafia sooner or later.
To the head of the mafia, yep.
Yeah. But it was one of the mob's most public hits. It's right in my neighborhood now. It was a little sandwich shop on Grand Avenue. A couple of hitmen just walked into the place, had everybody else line up against the wall except for Richard, and they put a gun to his head and shot him to death right there in the sandwich shop.
Wow, what a great story! Thank you for that, Adam. I was unaware of that. See, folks, you tune.
Yeah, look that one up.
Yeah, absolutely, I will, for sure.
Yeah, the sandwich shop is now a toffee shop.
By the way, the whole mob hit thing was put out into a book by Lamar Waldron that was optioned by Leonardo DiCaprio. It was supposed to be made into a movie. So that should be quite
interesting.
Well, yeah.
I just read Stephen King's book about the Kennedy assassination. That was very interesting.
Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah.
What scares you the most, Adam?
What scares me the most? Living people tend to scare me more than the dead ones.
Me too. Big time. Is Chicago safe? I would vouch yes.
It depends on where you go, but generally what I tell people is you hear a lot of stories about crime, but it's almost all related to buying and selling drugs. If you don't buy or sell drugs, you're pretty much safe.
Pretty much safe, for sure. Okay. The book is called Lincoln, Ghosts of Lincoln, folks. www.nightfrightshow.com. Adam Selzer's been our guest tonight. Adam, any final story you want to leave us with?
There's my favorite Lincoln story of all time that comes from a reasonably good source. It's not really a ghost story, but it's apparently while Lincoln was in the White House, a person from his old hometown in Kentucky came to visit and talk about draft issues. And Lincoln took advantage of the time to talk about, ask after every single family that he had known, his family had known back when he was a kid. And then he said, now, where's Austin Gollaher? Austin Gollaher was my childhood playmate, and this was a real guy. And he said, well, Austin played a dirty trick on me when we were kids, and I want to pay him back. And I'm cleaning up his language a little bit here because we're on the radio. But apparently they were out hunting squirrels, and Austin decided to take a nap at the bottom of a tree. And Lincoln said he saw him sitting there and left his hat sitting down by next to him, sitting open next to him. So he thought I would climb up the tree and poop in his hat. But then Austin switched hats with him. So he says, when I let the load drop, he switched hats with me so that my hat caught the whole charge. And I want to pay him back. So here he was in the White House plotting to lead the nation to victory in the Civil War. And at the same time, he was plotting to poop in Austin Gallagher's hat.
I think that's the best way to end it, with a potty joke. By the way,
Absolutely.
Austin Gallagher, when he was 10, jumped into a creek to save his friend from drowning, and that friend was a 7-year-old Abe Lincoln. True story. Adam, thank you so much for being with me on the way to Lincoln Park, live in Chicago. It worked out just fine, my friend.
All right, thank you.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Hall. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.